I wasn't in the hangar when Grant opened the box. I didn't need to be.
I know exactly what he saw because I put it there myself, 2 days before the wedding that was never going to happen. A converted World War II aircraft hangar out at Cobalt Field, $40,000 of rented elegance, corrugated steel walls painted the color of old bone, the kind of ceiling that makes footsteps echo twice before they die out, and nothing in it. No flowers, no caterers' tables, no band setting up in the corner where the old fuel drums used to sit. Just one folding table in the center of that enormous empty space, and on it, a small wooden box.
Inside the box was a silver medallion Grant had engraved the night he proposed. On the back, in letters he'd picked out himself, to the one who never leaves anyone behind. Next to it was a single sheet of paper. I know how his face changed when he read it, because I know Grant Whitfield. I spent 3 years learning every version of his face, the one he used when he was lying to his mother, the one he used when he was lying to me, and the one, rare and almost sincere, that showed up only when he thought no one was documenting it.
That afternoon, in an empty hangar, he got a 4th version. The one I'm told took almost a full minute to arrive, because for the first 30 seconds he just stood there, turning the medallion over in his hand like it might explain itself if he looked at it from a different angle. Behind him, in a white dress, commissioned weeks earlier without my knowledge, Vanessa Pratt stood very still in the doorway, watching a man who'd promised her something understand in real time, that the promise had never actually been his to give. That's the 4th version of his face. The one where a man finally realizes the person he decided didn't need to be consulted had been running the entire operation the whole time, and had been for 3 weeks.
But to understand how a venue that cost $40,000 ended up completely empty, you have to go back to a florist invoice that was never supposed to reach me.
My name is Josie Calder. I spent 9 years as an Army flight medic, the last 4 running medevac support out of forward operating bases in Kandahar province. And I finished my career the way a lot of us do, on a stretcher, in the back of my own aircraft, listening to someone else calling coordinates for the landing zone. An IED took most of the strength out of both my legs. Some days I walk with a cane. Some days I need forearm crutches. On the worst days, I don't leave the apartment before 10 in the morning because it takes that long for my body to agree to cooperate with the rest of me.
None of that ever stopped me from running an operation. It just meant I ran it sitting down. By the time I met Grant, I was 2 years out of the Army, running a 7-figure budget for the Ridgeline Veterans Housing Alliance, 3 federal agencies, 2 state authorities, 40 landlords who didn't always want tenants like me. Nothing fell through the cracks on my watch. In my old job, a crack like that meant somebody didn't make it onto the helicopter. I carried that habit home with me. I just didn't know yet how soon I'd need it in my own life.
Grant Whitfield never really understood what that meant. He understood I was in nonprofits. He understood I used to be in the military. At his mother's Christmas party, he introduced me to a room full of contractors and subcontractors as my fiancé. She was a medic, in the exact tone he might have used for she does yoga on weekends. Nobody in that room asked me a single question about my job. Several of them asked whether the cane was permanent. I let that happen for longer than I should have, because for the first year, everything else about Grant was real. He learned to time his stride to mine on stairs without ever making it a production. He drove 3 hours through the night after my second knee revision because he didn't want me waking up alone in a recovery room. And on a Saturday in late spring, 14 months before the wedding, he did something that still, even now, I have trouble filing away as calculated.
He'd scouted a hiking trail a full week in advance, walked it alone first, and identified the one overlook with a flat stone bench close enough to the trailhead that I wouldn't have to push my legs past what they could handle that day. He never told me that's what the scouting trip had been for. I only found out later, from a text thread with his college roommate that Vanessa, of all people, once forwarded to me by accident. At the overlook, he got down on one knee slowly, watching my face the way you watch someone's hands when you're not sure how they'll take news. And he opened a small box, holding not a ring, but a silver medallion, custom engraved at a shop downtown.
Dog tags felt like a joke, he said. I wanted something that actually meant it.
He turned it over so I could read the back. To the one who never leaves anyone behind.
"You never left anyone on that mountain," he told me. "Not once in 9 years." I looked it up. I wanted something that said that back to you.
The ring came out of his other pocket a moment later, almost as an afterthought, which told me everything about which object he'd actually spent the week thinking about. I said yes. I meant it completely. I want to be honest about that, because a story like mine is too easy to tell as pure villainy from the very beginning. And that isn't what happened to me. Grant was capable of real tenderness. He simply never learned the difference between tenderness and control. And by the time I understood that, I was 3 weeks from a wedding date. What I didn't know yet, that day at the Overlook, was that Grant had a second relationship in his life that predated ours by 20 years, one that ran on rules I was never given a copy of. Her name was Vanessa Pratt. She and Grant had grown up 2 houses apart on the same cul-de-sac. His mother, Diane, had unofficially adopted Vanessa somewhere around middle school after Vanessa's own parents split and her mother moved out of state, and Vanessa had spent her whole adult life financially tangled in the Whitfield family, a company top that paid more than the role justified, a car with payments Diane covered and called a loan, an apartment technically leased under the company's name. Here's the part I think you're already bracing for wrong. Vanessa wasn't a mistress. There was no affair to catch, no hotel receipt, nothing that simple. She was a dependent, 20 years deep in a family that had never once asked her to stand fully on her own. And depending on people you're not related to has a way of making a person very easy to move around, and very easy to move other people around on behalf of. I saw the pattern up close 5 weeks before the wedding, at a dinner Diane hosted at her house under the name Wedding Planning, though almost none of the evening ended up being about my wedding at all. Vanessa arrived without being asked what she wanted to drink, because Diane had already poured it. She mentioned halfway through the meal that her lease was coming up for renewal, and she wasn't sure what she'd do. And I watched Grant's fork pause midair, watched him glance at his mother, watched some silent transaction pass between the 3 of them that had clearly happened 100 times before and required no words at all. By the time dessert came out, Diane had decided the company would simply extend the lease another year, and Vanessa thanked her the way a child thanks a parent, not the way an adult thanks a landlord. Nobody at that table asked me a single question about the venue, the caterer, or the guest list. When I mentioned once that I'd finalized the florist contract that week, Diane said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Don't overdo it," in the tone of someone praising a child for finishing a puzzle slightly ahead of schedule. I remember sitting there thinking that I ran a 7-figure federal housing budget with more scrutiny applied to my judgment than this family applied to a 28-year-old's 4th temporary lease extension. I didn't know yet that the pattern I was watching at that table, money moving quietly, decisions made for people who weren't in the room to make them, care disguised as control, was about to point directly at me. 3 weeks before the ceremony, on a Tuesday morning, I was at my desk at Ridgeline, on the phone with the landlord in the middle of explaining for the second time that week why a lease violation notice needed to be rescinded, because the tenant's missed rent payment had been a VA disbursement delay and not negligence, when Eli Navarro knocked on my open door, holding a printed invoice. Eli lost his left leg below the knee outside Fallujah, and now runs logistics and IT for the Alliance, which mostly means he's the only other person in the building who reads every line of every invoice before it goes to accounting, a habit he picked up in the same place I picked up mine, somewhere a paperwork error could get somebody killed. "This isn't ours," he said, and set it on my desk without sitting down. "Wrong distro list. Florist meant to send it to you personally, not the office inbox. Must have had 2 tabs open." It was a receipt from a florist downtown, confirming a delivery of white peonies and eucalyptus for a private event. My wedding date was on it. My venue code was on it. My name was not.
The recipient line read Vanessa Pratt.
I looked at it for a long moment. Eli, to his credit, didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Figured you'd want to see it before it got buried in the shared drive," and went back to his own desk. Because in his world and mine, you hand someone the intelligence and let them decide what to do with it. That's a kind of respect most people never learn how to give. I called Grant that night and read him the line item over the phone, keeping my voice level, the same voice I used to use calling in a casualty count. "There is a florist invoice with Vanessa's name on it," I said. "Same venue code as ours, same delivery window."
There was a pause just half a second too long. "That's probably an admin mix-up," he said. "The florist does half the weddings in the county. Van helped me scout florists back in the spring, before you and I even landed on one. She's probably still in their system as a secondary contact from that." It was a plausible lie. That was always Grant's specialty. The kind of lie with just enough true material stitched into it that doubting it made you feel a little unreasonable.
"Okay," I said, and let it go. At least out loud. "You sound tired," he added. "Did you take your afternoon meds? I can bring dinner by." I told him I was fine. I did not tell him I had already saved a screenshot of the invoice to a folder I'd created that afternoon and labeled, plainly, "Wedding Discrepancies." I didn't let it go anywhere else that night. I lay awake instead and thought about a morning in the Hindu Kush I try not to revisit very often. We had 1 working aircraft and 11 casualties, and room for 8. I was the one who decided, in under 90 seconds, who got a seat and who waited for a second lift that might not make it in time. I chose based on triage category, the way I was trained to. Not based on rank, not based on who I liked, not based on anything but the numbers in front of me. The man I didn't choose did not survive the wait. I have spent 11 years living with the fact that the decision was correct by every protocol I know, and that it still cost a 23-year-old private his life. I still know his name. I don't say it out loud very often, even now. I tell you that not because it has anything to do with a florist invoice. I tell you it because it's the reason I don't move fast on decisions that affect other people, even when every part of me wants to. I learned, at the worst possible cost, that speed without information kills people. So instead of confronting Grant that week, I decided to gather intelligence first. It is, I recognize now, both my greatest strength and the reason it took me 3 more weeks to say the word fraud out loud, even inside my own head. 4 days after the invoice, doing the kind of routine account check I run every month out of pure habit, I logged into the joint account we'd opened to hold part of my VA disability settlement, money that belonged to me alone under federal law, but which Grant had limited transactional access to, by my own choice, because we'd agreed to use a portion of it toward the wedding and a house down payment. I was expecting to see the modest catering deposit we discussed the month before. Instead, I saw a withdrawal authorization for $47,000, dated 2 weeks earlier, with a signature on it that was supposed to be mine. At first glance, it looked exactly like mine. Same loops, same slant, same slight forward lean I've had since high school. But 18 months earlier, I'd had reconstructive surgery on the nerve cluster supporting my dominant hand, a lingering effect of the blast. The kind of injury that doesn't get fixed once and stay fixed, but gets managed in stages, with a follow-up procedure every couple of months, whether my calendar had room for it or not. Every signature I'd produced since the first surgery carried a small specific hitch on a capital C, a tremor a handwriting examiner would call diagnostic. This signature didn't have it. This signature was too clean, too even, drawn by a hand that had never had a reason to hesitate. For 1 bad hour that night, I doubted myself instead of him. I actually opened my own medical file and cross-checked the surgery date against the signature date, telling myself maybe I'd had an unusually good day with the tremor. Maybe I was inventing a conspiracy out of a coincidence. That doubt is exactly what people like Grant and Diane count on, without ever saying it out loud. That the person they're taking from will interrogate her own hands before she interrogates their intentions. 2 nights after that, I sat alone in my office at Ridgeline, long after everyone else had gone home, laptop open, desk lamp the only light in the building, and built a timeline the same way I used to build a casualty log during deployment, 1 confirmed data point at a time. Nothing entered until it could be sourced twice. I pulled 26 months of statements on that account, cross-referenced every withdrawal against the vendor calendar Grant had shared with me, and against his own company's job site logs, which were public record for anything involving a municipal permit. I found 2 prior withdrawals I hadn't flagged at the time because they'd been smaller and I'd been buried in a housing audit. $18,000 in March, logged in the memo field as venue deposit, and $24,000 in September, logged as vendor contracts. Neither matched an actual invoice from any vendor I had contracts with. Combined with the $47,000, that put $89,000 moving out of my federal disability settlement across 14 months, under authorizations I never gave, and in at least one case, physically could not have given. I printed all of it onto the same kind of supply tracking grid I used to fill out by hand in a tent with a headlamp clipped to my collar, columns for date, amount, description, and confirmed source. Because when your hands are unsteady and your chest is tight, a familiar format is the only thing that keeps your thinking straight instead of spiraling. By 1 a.m, I had a document that didn't feel like heartbreak. It felt like an after-action report. And after-action reports are the one kind of document I have always known exactly what to do with.
In the middle of building that timeline, I had one of the bad days, the kind where my legs simply refuse the morning, where getting from the bed to the bathroom takes 11 minutes I used to spend making coffee for 2. Grant stayed home from the office without being asked. He didn't make it a production. He just appeared at the doorway with my crutches already adjusted to the right height. And later, when the pain made it hard to sit upright long enough to eat, he brought a plate to the couch and sat on the floor beside it so we'd be at the same eye level. I let myself have that morning without doing any math on it.
I let it just be what it was. A man who loved me, taking care of me the way he always had, hours before I would drive to a stranger's office and put his mother's forged signature on a desk under a lamp. Both things were true. That's the part nobody warns you about. The tenderness doesn't stop being real just because it's standing next to a lie.
I needed someone who could tell me, professionally, whether I was reading it correctly.
I called Colonel Ruth Alvarez the next morning, retired now, but she'd been my commanding officer through 2 deployments. And in her second career, she ran document and benefits fraud cases for a veterans legal aid clinic 2 counties over, work she'd fallen into almost by accident, after helping one too many former soldiers untangle a family member who'd gotten too comfortable with their VA paperwork. She was also the officer who'd signed off on my medevac transfer the week I got hit, and who'd personally called my mother to explain what a level 1 trauma designation actually meant, because she didn't trust anyone junior to say it without softening it into something my mother wouldn't believe. I have never forgotten that she chose accuracy over comfort that day, even when comfort would have been so much easier for everyone in the room, including her. Ruth doesn't view small talk. It's one of the reasons I trust her completely. I drove out to her office that afternoon and put both signatures on her desk, side by side, under a lamp, the old one from my VA determination file, and the one on the withdrawal authorization. She studied them without a word for almost 5 full minutes, turning the pages under different angles of light, tracing something with the capped end of a pen. "Pen pressure's wrong on this one," she finally said, tapping the withdrawal form. "Yours drags right at the end of every downstroke. Old injury habit, I'd guess. And it's consistent across every sample in your file going back a 1.5 years. This signature is even all the way through. Whoever produced it is either very good or wasn't trying that hard because they never expected anyone to hold the 2 side by side." She looked up. "What's the date on this withdrawal?" I told her. She pulled out her phone, scrolled, and turned the screen toward me, a calendar reminder from a case she'd consulted on for me the year before, the exact date I'd been under sedation in an outpatient surgical suite for a follow-up procedure on that same nerve cluster, physically incapable of holding a pen steady enough to sign a grocery receipt, let alone a federal withdrawal form. "You've got a hospital record placing you somewhere else entirely at the exact hour this was authorized," Ruth said. "That's not a shaky maybe anymore, Josie. That's forgery with an alibi already attached to it. Who had access to this account?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the sentence that ended whatever hope I'd been keeping in reserve, the last small folder in my head, still labeled, "Maybe there's an explanation." "Then I think you already know what you have to do. You're just deciding whether you're ready to do it yet." I wasn't. Not that night. I went home and did something I'm not entirely proud of. I tested him gently, the way you'd probe a wound to see how deep it actually runs before you decide how to treat it. Over dinner, I mentioned I'd been going through the wedding budget and noticed the balance was lower than I'd expected. I watched his face very closely. I have sat through enough debriefs to know what a prepared answer looks like versus a spontaneous one, and his came out too smooth, too unhurried, already shaped before I'd finished the sentence. "Some of the vendor deposits went out early," he said. "My mom helped coordinate a few things while you were dealing with the PT schedule. I didn't want to bother you with the logistics on top of everything else." "That's a lot of money to move without telling me," I said, keeping my voice level. "Where were you on the 14th? That's the date on the last withdrawal." He didn't hesitate long enough for it to look suspicious to anyone who hadn't spent 9 years reading faces for a living. "Job site walkthrough out on the Meridian project, all day, pretty much. He reached for his water glass. Why does the date matter? It mattered because I already knew, from the same public permit filings I'd pulled that week out of habit, that the Meridian project hadn't broken ground until 9 days after the 14th. I didn't say that out loud. I filed it, the way you file anything you're not ready to use yet. And I said only, no reason, just trying to keep track of everything before the ceremony. You didn't think I'd want to know $89,000 moved out of my account? I asked, a moment later, quieter now. For half a second, something real flickered across his face, the version I'd learned to recognize under all the others. Then it smoothed back over. It's not 89,000. It's, Josie, why are you sitting up counting numbers like this at night? You should be resting. I've got the wedding handled. I've got the wedding handled, he said it gently. I believe, even now, that he thought he was being kind. That's the part of this story I need you to understand, because it's the part that makes it more than a simple case of someone cheating. Grant did learn to help me downstairs without turning it into theater. He did drive 3 hours through the night after surgery. None of that was a performance. What was corrosive was the quiet, unspoken conclusion he'd drawn from all of it over 3 years, that loving me and managing me had become the same activity in his mind, that a woman who needed a cane on bad days must also need someone else to hold her signature, her money, and eventually her own wedding. He was wrong about that in a way that was about to cost him everything he actually cared about. 2 nights later, Diane showed up at my apartment unannounced, holding a casserole dish and a folder of a few ideas for the ceremony program. She sat at my kitchen table, glanced at the cane leaning against the counter, and said in the same warm voice she'd used my entire relationship with her son, "You look worn thin, sweetheart. I keep telling Grant, the 2 of you are trying to do too much yourselves. Let us help more. That's what family's for." I thanked her for the casserole. I did not mention the withdrawal, the signature, or Ruth's assessment. I had learned in 9 years of triage that you don't reveal your read on the situation to the person who might still be useful as a source of information. I let her talk. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Grant had been handling some of the vendor payments directly to take the pressure off, and that she'd been helping him stay organized. It was the closest anyone in that family ever came to confessing anything to my face, and she said it while cutting me a slice of pie. That night, lying awake next to a man I still loved and no longer trusted, I made the only decision in this entire story that actually mattered. I would not confront him across a dinner table where he'd had 3 weeks to prepare better lies. I would not scream. I had made one triage decision too fast, once, under fire, and I had spent 11 years carrying the price of moving before I had full information. I would not repeat that mistake here, where I had the luxury of time, and he did not know I was using it. I had full information now, so I moved, but I moved the way I was trained to move, quietly, in sequence, each step covering the one behind it, until there was nothing left for anyone to negotiate with, because there was nothing left to take. If you've ever found out that someone was managing you instead of loving you, you already know the exact moment I'm describing, the one where the fear turns into something colder and far more useful. That's the moment this story is really about, not the wedding, what happens after you stop asking to be believed and start building a case instead. The first move was the account itself. I drove to the bank the next morning with my hospital records, my VA disability determination letter, and Ruth's written preliminary assessment of the signature discrepancy. The federal disability settlement was legally mine alone. Grant's access had only ever existed because I'd granted it as an authorized user, a status I could revoke unilaterally with the right documentation behind it. The compliance officer who reviewed my file did not treat it as routine. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said, reading through the alibi date twice. "Once I flag this internally, it triggers a fraud review on our end, regardless of what you decide to do externally. I can't make that quiet, even if you wanted it to be." "I don't want it quiet," I said. She nodded once, like that was the correct answer, and had every outstanding authorization on the account frozen before I'd finished signing the revocation paperwork. Grant's name came off that account before lunch. He didn't know yet. That was the entire point. The second move took longer, and it required something I'd never had to use in civilian life before.
The same calm, unhurried voice I used to use talking a panicked patient through a procedure mid-flight. The voice that says, "I have this. You don't need to," without ever raising in volume. Over the following 10 days, I contacted every vendor tied to our wedding: the caterer, the florist, the string quartet, the rental company supplying tables and the arbor, the hangar's own event coordinator, one at a time, using the authority I actually held as the signer of record on every one of those contracts. I had signed the originals. My name, not Grant's, carried legal standing to cancel them.
I kept each call short. The event is being canceled. Please confirm in writing that all future services are terminated and any refundable deposits are returned to the account of record. No explanations offered, and when the florist's coordinator asked, gently, if everything was all right, I said only, "There's been a change in circumstances," and let her fill in whatever kind story she wanted.
The string quartet's manager was the only one who pushed for details. "We block off dates a year in advance," he told me. "Canceling this close in, that's usually a family emergency or worse. You doing okay?" It was the first genuinely kind question anyone outside Ridgeline had asked me in 3 weeks, and it caught me off guard enough that I almost told him the truth. Instead, I said, "I'm doing better than I was a month ago," which was, technically, already becoming accurate.
The caterer pushed back once, citing the cancellation window in the contract and a possible forfeiture of half the deposit. I read her the clause back to her, correctly, from memory, the way I used to recite drug dosages on a moving aircraft, and she went quiet, then apologized, then processed the refund without further argument. Being underestimated works both ways. Nobody expects the soft-spoken woman with the cane to have memorized her own contract. One call almost broke the whole operation. The hangar's event manager, working off an early planning sheet, called the number on file to confirm the cancellation, and the number on file was Grant's. I got a text from him 20 minutes later. "Why is the venue asking me to confirm we're canceling?" Some mix-up on their end, told them we're still on. I called the coordinator myself within the hour, sent over the original signed contract with my signature highlighted in yellow, and asked her to update the primary point of contact to me exclusively, citing account security concerns tied to a fraud matter I couldn't discuss further. She apologized for the confusion and made the change without asking why. Grant never learned the correction had happened, because I never gave him a second reason to check.
By the end of that week, every vendor tied to our wedding had been formally released. The hangar reservation itself I let stand. I still needed it, just not for what he thought.
For 4 days after that, I let myself believe the hardest part was over. The account was frozen. The vendors were gone. Grant still didn't know any of it. I told myself what was left was just paperwork, waiting for a referral to move through a federal queue, waiting for a date on the calendar to finish meaning what it used to mean. I was wrong about that. The hardest part hadn't come from Grant yet at all.
My board chair at Ridgeline, a retired Navy JAG officer named Patricia Osei, who reads people for a living almost as well as I do, stopped by my office that same week and closed a door behind her, which she never does. "You've been canceling personal calendar events off the shared system for 10 days, she said, not unkindly. "I'm not going to ask what it is. I am going to tell you that if you need to take leave, it's yours, no explanation required. And if you need this office's resources for something outside work, that's yours too. Quietly, no board minutes." I thanked her. I didn't take her up on either offer, not because I didn't need it, but because I'd already built the case I needed with what I had.
What she gave me instead, without either of us naming it directly, was the simple experience of being trusted to handle something serious without anyone demanding to manage it for me. I noticed the contrast. I don't think I'd fully let myself notice it until that exact moment.
While all of that was happening quietly, Diane made her final move, and it told me, more than the forged signature ever had, exactly what kind of family I was about to walk away from. She invited me to lunch, which she had never once done alone in 3 years. Over salads neither of us touched, at a restaurant she'd chosen specifically because it was quiet enough for the conversation she'd planned. She told me she'd noticed I'd seemed overwhelmed lately, that planning a wedding on top of everything you manage physically was clearly too much for one person, and that she and the company's attorney had drafted something that might help. A durable power of attorney over the wedding fund and household finances. Temporary, she said, just until after the ceremony, so Grant could handle the stressful logistics without me having to worry about paperwork.
She slid the document across the table like it was a gift she was proud of.
"You don't have to decide today," she added, when I didn't reach for it right away. "I just think you'd feel so much lighter if you let someone else carry this part. You've carried enough for one lifetime already, sweetheart."
I need to be precise about what that page actually was, because it matters. It wasn't a joint decision between partners. It was a permanent transfer of financial authority away from a disabled woman, initiated by the same family that had already forged her signature once, packaged entirely as an act of care. If I had signed it, there would have been no fraud case left standing, because I would have voluntarily handed over the exact authority they had already stolen. It would have made everything that came before it retroactively legitimate. I looked at that page for a long moment. Then I looked at Diane and told her, in the same level voice I'd used on the phone with Grant, that I was already aware of the $47,000 withdrawal, the two before it, and the forged signature on the authorization form. Her expression didn't crumble. It hardened, fast, the way a door closes when someone's leaning their weight into it from the other side. "That's a family matter," she said. "You don't understand how much this means to certain people who don't get another shot at something like this." "Vanessa isn't entitled to my disability settlement," I said, "and neither is the company's cash flow problem." That last part wasn't a guess. By then, I'd already pulled the public filings, a lien notice sitting in the county recorder's database, found the same way I find everything, out of professional habit. And I knew for a fact that Whitfield & Sons Construction had missed loan covenants twice in the past year. I watched the fact land. I watched Diane understand in real time that I already knew more than she'd planned for, and that the woman she'd decided was too tired to notice had in fact been building a file on her company's finances for a week. "You have no idea what you're threatening to unravel," she said, her voice dropping to something almost quiet. "This company employs 40 people, Josie. 40 families." "None of those 40 families forged my signature," I said. "You did, or Grant did. One of you can tell me which, but it isn't going to change what happens next." She didn't deny any of it after that. She left cash on the table for a lunch neither of us had eaten, and said only, "You'll regret making this ugly," before she walked out. I sat there for a while after she left, turning the unsigned power of attorney over in my hands. I don't think Diane ever saw herself as someone stealing from a wounded veteran. I think she saw herself as someone holding a company together with both hands, terrified of what 40 employees losing their jobs would say about her at the same country club dinners where she'd spent 30 years being the woman who always had things handled. Fear dressed up as competence is still fear. It just wears better clothes. Understanding that didn't make me forgive her. It just made the rest of what I had to do feel less like an attack and more like something closer to gravity, the natural, unavoidable weight of a lie finally meeting the ground. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there alone. I felt something closer to relief, the specific, clarifying relief of finally having permission from the people themselves to stop protecting a version of them that had never actually existed. That night, I did the last two things on my list. I called the attorney Ruth had connected me with, a veterans benefits fraud specialist with informal ties to the VA Inspector General's office, and formally submitted the signature discrepancy, the hospital alibi record, and the full transaction timeline for review. He told me it would likely take several weeks to move from intake to a formal case, since federal disability funds were involved, but that the documentation I'd assembled, thanks to that supply tracking format Ruth had teased me about for years, was, in his words, cleaner than most of the referrals I get from actual accountants. Then I did the part that had nothing to do with fraud at all. I took the medallion out of the small wooden box where I'd kept it on my dresser since the night Grant proposed, and I read the inscription one more time, slowly, because I wanted to remember exactly how it had felt to believe it without any qualification. To the one who never leaves anyone behind. Then I packed it, along with a single typed page, into a box I would leave at the hangar myself 2 days before the wedding, arranged through the venue's remaining skeleton staff, under the simple explanation that I was setting up a surprise for the couple. The page said, "Grant, the account is closed. The vendors are canceled. The fraud referral has been filed with my attorney and the VA Inspector General's office regarding the withdrawals authorized under my forged signature. I am not marrying you. This medallion was the truest thing you ever gave me, so I'm giving it back.
Not because I don't believe you meant it once, but because a person who genuinely believes I never leave anyone behind should not have needed to leave me out of every decision that touched my own money. Josie.
I did not send it by text. I did not call. I left it in an empty hanger and let the empty room say the rest of it for me. On the morning of what would have been my wedding day, I was 3 states away at a housing intake event Ridgeline runs twice a year for veterans coming out of transitional shelters. I spent the morning sitting across a folding table from a former combat engineer named Marcus, walking him through a lease application for a 1-bedroom apartment he was about to move into, after 11 months of sleeping in the bed of his truck outside a rest stop off I-70. "You sure you don't need to be somewhere else today?" he asked me at one point, glancing at the clock on the wall, half joking. "I'm exactly where I need to be," I told him, and I meant every word of it. It felt like the correct use of a day I had once expected to spend getting married. I know what happened at the hangar only because I planned every piece of it, and because Vanessa called me 3 days later, her voice raw, and told me the rest without my having to ask a single question. Grant arrived early, alone, wanting to check on setup before guests began arriving for what Diane had quietly billed to a small circle of family friends as an intimate private ceremony. He found an empty room. No caterer, no flowers, no quartet warming up instruments in the corner, just one folding table and the box. And Vanessa told me later, the only sound in the whole building was his own footsteps, echoing off steel walls built for airplanes, not for a man standing alone realizing what he'd lost. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later and found Grant standing alone in the middle of that vast, hollow space, holding a medallion he'd given someone else, reading a page that told him, in plain language, exactly how much he hadn't been paying attention. "He didn't even try to explain it to me at first," Vanessa told me on the phone. "He just kept saying, she couldn't have done all this by herself. She's supposed to be resting. Like your legs had anything to do with your brain, like the two things were the same organ." I asked her, gently, if she'd known where the wedding money had actually come from. There was a long pause on the line. "I knew there was money for the day," she said finally. "I didn't ask where it came from. I think some part of me didn't want the answer." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Josie. I don't expect that to fix anything." It didn't fix anything, but it was more honest than anything Grant said to me for the rest of that year, and I told her so, and I meant that too. That same evening, I sent one email to both families, mine and the Whitfields, laying out the facts in chronological order: the invoice, the signature, the hospital alibi, the fraud referral, the empty hanger. No accusations beyond what the documents already proved. I ended it with a single line: "I have ended the engagement. Please do not ask me to reconsider, and please do not ask me to explain anyone else's intentions to me." My mother's reply came within the hour. 3 words: "Good, come home." Diane's reply came 2 days later, 4 paragraphs long, explaining that families handle things imperfectly sometimes, and that she hoped I'd eventually understand Grant had only ever tried to protect everyone at once. I read it twice. Then I did something I would not have done a year earlier. I didn't soften my answer just to keep the peace. I wrote back one sentence: "Protecting everyone at once is usually just another way of protecting no one specifically, including me." I never heard from her again. His attorney called mine 40 minutes after the hangar, not Grant himself, which told me everything I needed to know about how the conversation with Diane had gone in that empty room. Whitfield and Sons legal counsel wanted to know if this could be handled quietly as a family matter. My attorney's answer was one sentence: the referral had already been filed with a federal oversight office, and quiet was no longer available as an option on the table. The VA Inspector General's office opened a formal fraud inquiry 6 weeks later. Because the funds in question were federal disability compensation, and because a falsified signature had been used to authorize withdrawals from a federally protected account, the case moved further than a private family dispute ever would have. It eventually resulted in Grant being required to make full financial restitution of the $89,000 under a consent agreement his attorney negotiated to avoid a criminal referral, along with a civil judgment placing a lien against his share of the family company's assets until the debt was satisfied in full. Whitfield and Sons lost its 2 largest contracts within the year. Once subcontractors caught wind of the federal inquiry. Grant kept his job, but lost the authority that came with it. No bonding insurer would let him sign for anything again. Diane stepped down 8 months later, quietly, handing the company to Grant's younger brother, who put every large disbursement through a 2-signature audit and slowly rebuilt what she'd spent 30 years risking. I heard the rest from Ruth, months on. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like a chapter that had stopped being about me. Vanessa moved out of the company-leased apartment within 2 months. She enrolled that fall in a dental hygiene certification program on her own name, her own student loans, her own signature at the bottom of the page. We are not friends. We are, I think, 2 women who briefly stood on opposite sides of a decision neither of us fully made, and who eventually chose not to blame each other for the parts we never controlled. Grant tried to call me 4 times in the 2 months after the wedding that didn't happen. I let all 4 go to voicemail. He left one message I actually listened to, in full, sitting in my car in the Ridgeline parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "I know I'm not going to fix this with a phone call," he said. "I keep trying to figure out the exact moment I decided you couldn't handle knowing. I don't have a good answer. I just know I'm the only one who ever benefited from believing it." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I almost thought the message had ended. "I hope whatever you build next, you build it exactly the way you want it, with nobody managing you out of the decisions that are actually yours." I didn't call him back, but I saved the message, not out of sentiment, out of something closer to closure. It was the first fully honest sentence he'd said to me in over a year, and it arrived about 14 months too late to change anything, except my own peace of mind on the drive home that night. The $89,000, once fully recovered through the restitution agreement, didn't go back into a wedding fund, because there was no wedding left to fund. I used it to seed something new instead, a small transitional grant program inside Ridgeline for veterans navigating VA benefits fraud or predatory financial arrangements inside their own families. The kind of quiet, specific harm that rarely makes headlines, because from the outside it looks exactly like a family helping out. We named it the Calder-Alvarez Fund, over Ruth's loud and specific objections that it should just carry my name alone. In its first year, it has helped 11 veterans recover money that was taken from them the exact same way mine nearly was, by someone who loved them, and who decided, somewhere along the way, that loving them meant deciding for them. I started meeting Eli Navarro for coffee about 4 months after the hangar, not because either of us planned it as anything in particular, but because we'd started grabbing lunch on days we were both buried in casework, and it had quietly become a standing habit neither of us bothered to name out loud. He has never once opened a door for me faster than I could open it myself, and he has never once treated my cane as an explanation for anything about my judgment. When I finally told him the whole story, the invoice, the signature, the hangar, all of it, he listened without interrupting once, the way you listen to a mission debrief. And at the end, he said only, "You ran that whole thing like an extraction. No wasted movement." It is, to this day, one of the best compliments anyone has ever given me, and it took me a long time to notice it had been a compliment at all, and not just an observation. 14 months after the wedding that never happened, I stood outside a 4-unit apartment building Ridgeline had just finished renovating, holding a pair of oversized scissors for a ribbon cutting nobody had told me I'd be doing, and watched Marcus, the former combat engineer from that intake event, carry the last box into his new 1-bedroom unit with his own 2 hands. No help required, no help offered unless he asked for it first. "Feels different, having a door with my name on the lease," he told me afterward, standing in his own kitchen for the first time in almost a year. "It should," I said. "It's yours." He nodded slowly, running a hand along the new countertop, like he still didn't quite trust it wasn't a mistake someone would come back and correct. "Eli told me you fought the county for 6 weeks to get this unit ADA compliant before I'd even finished my application," he said. "That true?" "That's the job," I said, and left it there. Because it was. And because some sentences don't need decoration to land. Eli was there too, going over the unit's smart thermostat with Marcus, and at one point he caught my eye across the kitchen and gave me the smallest nod, the kind 2 people give each other when they both know exactly what a closed door with someone's name on it actually costs to open. Nobody in that kitchen needed the story behind the Calder-Alvarez Fund to understand what the ribbon cutting was really about. The fund doesn't put anyone's name in bronze on a wall.
It puts locks on doors that used to belong to landlords and financial advisors, and in at least 11 cases now, family members who'd convinced themselves that helping and controlling were the same verb. Standing there, I thought about the version of me who had almost signed a piece of paper handing over financial control of my own life because someone I trusted told me it would be easier that way. I thought about how close easier had come to costing me everything I had spent a career learning how to protect: my judgment, my authority over my own decisions, the plain fact that a body that needs a cane on hard days is still attached to a mind fully capable of running an extraction under fire on no notice with the lights off. Sometimes on a slow afternoon at the office, I still think about the color of those hanger walls, old bone, the kind of pale that isn't quite white, and how a room built that big never really goes silent. It just echoes twice and waits for someone to decide what happens next. I decided a long time ago. I still have the engraving receipt from that little shop downtown, tucked in a drawer I rarely open. I never got the medallion back, and I never asked for it. Grant can keep it, or melt it down, or leave it in a box somewhere, the way he left me out of a decision touching my own money for 3 weeks without knowing it. The words on the back were never really about him giving me credit for 9 years of not leaving anyone behind. They were a description of who I already was, with or without his permission to say it out loud. It took losing an engagement to understand that the sentence never needed his signature to be true. It only ever needed mine. I didn't leave that marriage because I wanted revenge. I left it because the moment Grant decided my forged signature was an acceptable cost of managing me, he made a decision about my life without me in the room. And I had already spent one morning in the Hindu Kush learning exactly what that costs, and exactly how fast I never wanted to make that mistake again, in either direction, for the rest of my life. If any part of this sounds familiar to you, if someone in your life has ever mistaken your injury, your illness, your quiet patience, or your grief for an invitation to start making decisions on your behalf, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It's cover. Use it exactly the way I did. Gather everything quietly, in order, with proof at every single step, before you say a word out loud to anyone who benefits from you staying confused. If this story meant something to you tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more stories about people who were underestimated right up until the moment it cost someone everything they had, subscribe and stay close. There's more coming.